Hi, thank you for coming out tonight. Before I get started, I'd like to thank Brenda, Rex, Rebecca, Rick, everyone from the Show Me Institute, as well as everyone here from the St. Louis University and the Cook School of Business for being such wonderful hosts. I've had a great time here, and I really appreciate it. I've been told my presentation is a lot of gloom and doom, so I'll get the gloomiest and doomiest part out of the way. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm here to help. Overall, the big news of the last couple days has been the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. And that has focused a lot of us on the threat of terrorism. It's made us remember 9/11 and the threat we saw to ourselves, our nation, and our future from Islamic terrorism. But that's not the only threat to our future. There is a more subtle threat to our future, to our families, and that's an economic threat. It's more subtle, it's more hidden, but it's no less real. It's also, what I'm going to describe tonight, the single greatest economic threat of our era. And by the time the crisis hits, it'll be too late to avert a lot of the damage. What I'm going to be speaking on is the historic rise in federal spending and debt, and what it means for our economy, for our ability to prosper, to create jobs, to raise incomes, to reduce poverty, and to leave a better country to our kids and our grandkids than the country we have for ourselves. One thing to remember, I'm going to give a lot of numbers because I'm a geek. I'm a budget person. I travel with PowerPoint to everywhere except the grocery store. So I'm going to throw a lot of numbers. But what I'm going to talk about tonight isn't about numbers. It's about our future. And it's about ringing the bell now and getting the word out now so that we can avert the crisis before it happens. Because, you know, there's not a lot of opportunities to avert a crisis before it happens. This is one of them. To open it up, let's take a look at deficits and debt. We've all known that the budget deficit is growing. In fact, since 2007, the budget deficit has nearly dectupled from $160 billion to $1.5 trillion. That means that right now, 40 cents out of every dollar Washington spends is borrowed. Think if your family had to borrow 40 cents of every dollar you spent. Your economic finances would not last very well very long. That's the situation we face right now. 40 cents out of every dollar Washington spends is borrowed. A lot of us are hoping the deficit is a temporary result of the recession, and that it'll go away when the economy gets better. But if we continue current tax and spending trends, it actually gets worse. By the end of this decade, the deficit is going to be nearly $2 trillion a year. And that assumes peace, prosperity, and low interest rates. That's the rosy scenario. I told you it was going to be gloom and doom. I warned you. As a result, when the deficit goes up, when you're borrowing more, you got to pay more interest. Well, the annual cost of paying interest on the debt is set to grow in a very scary shape. It's set to more than quadruple by the end of this decade to $1 trillion a year. That means that by the end of this decade, when you pay your income taxes, half of your income taxes will go to paying interest on the debt. That means half of your income taxes won't help keep a troop safe, finance a Social Security benefit, pave a highway, or keep a family out of poverty. Half of what you pay on April 15th and is withheld during the course of the year will just pay the interest on the debt. Pretty scary stuff. So overall, the way us geeks like to look at the economy, or look at the debt, is as a percentage of the economy. Just like a family measures your debt as a percentage of your income, we measure the government's debt as a percentage of the national income. We've actually had a lot of debt before. In World War II, the debt was actually 109% of our national income. The debt was bigger than the entire GDP. But the good news, the war ended. And when the war ended, the economy started growing faster than the debt, so the debt became a smaller share of the economy. But look at it now. From 40% of the economy, we're on course to have the debt go right up to 100% of the economy in the next 10 years. And again, the debt will be bigger than the entire economy. Now, a lot of economists say once the debt becomes bigger than 90% of GDP, economic growth rates get cut in half. We'll be there in a few years. It gets worse. Let's extend this out. According to the Congressional Budget Office, and again, this is not my calculation, this is according to the Congressional Budget Office, if we just continue today's tax and spending policies, do nothing different, this is what happens to the national debt. 200, 300, 400, 500, 600% of our national income. I can assure you that will never actually happen, because according to the Congressional Budget Office, their models collapse in the 2030s. The economy essentially ceases to function. Let me remind you, this is with no change in current policies. This is if we just keep everything the way it is. So the next question is, what's causing this? Why is the budget suddenly growing out of control? The answer, in a short, basic answer, is runaway government spending. One way that I like to describe budget is in per household terms. I think that's easier to understand than billions and trillions. You actually may have an op-ed that I wrote recently for the Knight Ritter Wire that actually breaks down federal spending per household by program. And if you don't have it, you might be able to get it out there afterwards. In the 80s and 90s, Washington spent $22,000 per household per year. President Bush increased it to $25,000 per household. A lot of it was for the war on terrorism. Most of it wasn't. We had a very big spending spree under President Bush. You think that's a lot. This year, $31,000 per household is what Washington will spend. Raise your hand if you're getting your money's worth. Okay, one. Actually, this year, Washington is only going to tax $18,000 per household. The other $13,000 per household, dump in the laps of your children and grandchildren to repay. But it gets worse. Keep in mind, this is all adjusted for inflation. If we continue on current trends, Washington's going to be spending more than $38,000 per household by the end of the decade. So the crux of the budget problem is pretty simple. If spending is going to go up by $13,000 per household, at some point, taxes are going to have to go up by $13,000 per household. I don't know a lot of people who can afford that. If we're going to spend $38,000 per household, eventually we're going to have to tax $38,000 per household. This is my favorite chart, along with the next one. I still like these percents of national income. Bear with me. Historically, tax revenues have come in at 18% of the economy. It doesn't matter. We've had a top tax rate of 91%. We've had a top tax rate as low as 28%. And regardless, revenues basically come in at 18% of the economy. Spiked a little bit in 2000 with the bubble, and has dropped a little bit now. But what's interesting, by the end of this decade, when the economy recovers, it's going to come right back to 18% of GDP. And that's even if we extend every dollar of the Bush tax cuts. Even if we extend it for everybody, we are still going to be taxing actually slightly above the historical average. There's no long-term revenue decline at all, by any measure. The spending picture, though, is a little different, the blue line. Historically, we've spent 20% of the national income in Washington. By the way, you notice the little difference between these two? That's been the structural deficit, about 2% of the economy. We've just had a huge spending spike, up to 24% of the economy. Stimulus, bailouts, recession, huge domestic spending increases. But even when that phases out, spending keeps going. 26.5% of the national economy by the end of this decade. So to really put it pretty basic, remember before I showed you that we're going to have a $2 trillion deficit by the end of the decade? Spending is the moving variable. The deficit will be 6% of GDP above average because spending is going to be 6% of GDP above average. There's no revenue decline. The long-term moving variable is runaway spending. To extend it out further, according to the Congressional Budget Office, this is what spending looks like long-term. 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the nation's income spent by Washington. Not spent by you, spent by Washington. Again, tax revenues are steady. They're going to be right back at the same 50-year average. Spending keeps going. What we have is a long-term spending problem. The next basic question, well, what's driving spending so high? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and as a result, net interest are the main drivers. This is an interesting chart. This is the composition of the federal budget over the past 50 years. One interesting note, under President Kennedy, we spent half the budget on defense. Now we spend 1/5, and that's including the war on terrorism. That's including everything. Social Security and Medicare, however, are growing a lot, up to 1/3 of the budget, and it's on course to keep going after that, up to 40, 50, 60, 70% of the budget. Essentially, the national security state has been replaced by the entitlement state. Now, this has had a lot of benefits. You know, we've been able to keep the country generally safe without spending as much of the budget on defense, and we've been able to provide a good safety net and provide security in retirement for a lot of people. This isn't a bad thing. Unfortunately, however, the current trends are just not sustainable. If you take a look at the spending trends for the next decade, where you grow, this is adjusted for inflation, you see where the growth is. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and net interest. That's where the new spending is coming from. The big entitlement programs. It's not all foreign aid. It's not all bailouts. It's really the big entitlements are what's driving the spending trends upward. And again, this is all data straight from the Congressional Budget Office. This requires a little deeper discussion of what's happening with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Why are they costing so much money? Why are programs that have been perfectly sustainable for so long and that have benefited people for so long suddenly become unsustainable? The first answer is demographics. 77 million baby boomers have begun retiring. Social Security and Medicare are pay-as-you-go programs. Today's taxpayers fund today's retirees. The Social Security Trust Fund that you think is funding retirees got raided. Today's retirees have to be funded by today's taxpayers. It works as long as there's enough workers to pay the benefits of the retirees. In 1960, you had 5 workers paying the benefits of each retiree. Today, you only have 3 workers, and by 2030, 2 to 1. Now, to put that in perspective, the 2 to 1 ratio, imagine a boy and a girl born today in 2011. 19 years from now, in 2030, they marry and start a family. They're going to have to support themselves, their children, and the Social Security and Medicare benefits of their very own retiree. Every couple starting out. Now imagine that young couple. You just graduated from college. You probably have about $70,000 or $80,000 in student loans, given the trends in cost of going to college. You want to have kids. Daycare is enormously expensive. You want to buy a house. You're just getting your first job on an entry-level income. and now you have the burden of paying for the entire pension and health care costs of your own retiree. That is going to be an enormous, enormous burden that is going to be handed to people born today. Now, let me emphasize, this is not the fault of the baby boomers. This is not the fault of anybody. Well, if there is the fault of the baby boomers, you didn't have enough kids. If you would have had enough kids, there'd be enough taxpayers to pay the benefits. But ultimately, this isn't a matter of assessing blame. The baby boomers did nothing wrong. It's just the simple matter that there's a lot of them, and there's not a lot of taxpayers, and so the demographics just make it tough to finance these programs. Now, in addition to demographics, Medicare has to deal with the cost of rising health care. You have to increase Medicare spending 7 or 8% per year just to provide the same benefits to the same people before you even added on 77 million baby boomers. As a result, the long-term deficit for Medicare is 6 times bigger than the long-term deficit for Social Security. I don't like the big numbers, but the long-term deficit for Social Security is $6 trillion. The long-term deficit for Medicare, $36 trillion. And by the way, those are rosy scenarios. I mean, during Q&A, that assumes the growth of healthcare costs slows down. In addition, Medicaid is affected because Medicare doesn't cover long-term care in nursing homes. So when a lot of people end up needing to go in nursing homes, that's going to cost Medicaid. So if you put these costs in perspective, the total cost of these 3 programs is going to go from 8% of the economy to almost 19% of the economy, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Now remember, historically, Washington has spent 20% of national income. If you're spending 18.6 on these programs, there ain't room for much else. And oh, by the way, net interest would probably double that amount. I mentioned earlier that Medicare has the additional problem of rising healthcare costs. You see that here. The red is growing a lot faster than the blue because we have to tame the growth in healthcare costs. So what do we do about this? Well, in Washington, the first answer is always take more money from your pocket. We could raise taxes. But ultimately, remember, this is not a problem of declining revenues, it's a problem of rising spending. The problem is that we promised more benefits than the taxpayers can afford. Now, when parents buy a house that's too big, the answer isn't to tell the kids to get a second and third job. The answer is for the parents to move to a smaller house. I believe that if we're worried about drowning our next generation in debt, drowning them in taxes really isn't much more compassionate. You know, the answer is for mom and dad to move to a small, if you bought too big of a house that you can't afford, to perhaps move to a smaller house, rather than telling the kids to get an additional job. But if, let's say for an argument we are going to rely on taxes. Missourians would have to face, middle-class Missourians would have to be put into a 63% income tax bracket. Upper class and small businesses into an 88% tax bracket. That's just the income tax. You're still paying the payroll tax and the state taxes. But the middle class would have to be put in a 63% bracket and the upper class and small businesses into an 88% bracket just to pay the benefits currently scheduled in law. No expansion, just to keep it on autopilot. If you do that, the economy stops. I mean, we've seen in Europe what happens when you have high taxes. You have fewer jobs, less growth, more poverty. It's simple. When you tax something, people do less of it. The reason we tax tobacco is because we want people to smoke less. Part of the reason we tax gasoline is because we want people to drive less. Well, if you tax working, saving, and investing, people will work, save, and invest less. So you would have a very tough effect on the economy. By the way, for those who just say, well, raise taxes on the rich, you could tax the richest 10% at a 100% tax rate. Assume they still go to work, still wouldn't close the gap. It's that big. And as a matter of fact, repealing the Bush tax cuts for everybody, not just the rich, would close 1/10 of the gap. But there's another problem with raising taxes. Who in here believes that if we raise taxes, Washington would actually put the money towards deficit reduction rather than just spend it on youth programs? Does anyone trust government to put it towards deficit reduction? Their track record isn't very good. When they get new, I work across from the Capitol. When they get new money, they spend it. They don't put it towards deficit reduction. So personally, I'm not a big fan of the tax hike option.
Well, there's a second option. We could just cut other spending. If we were to cut other spending, we'd actually have to eliminate every program in the entire federal budget to make up for this cost. You'd have to close down the Defense Department, the Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, you name it. There's a third option. We can just do nothing and hope the problem solves itself. You know, some people say these are long-term projections. You don't know what's going to happen next week, much less in 5 or 10 years. That's true when you're talking about inflation. But the retirement of 77 million baby boomers is not a theoretical projection. Many of you are in this room. You walk among us. You are not a projection. You have paid taxes and you want your money. And justifiably so. This isn't a projection. This is demographics. Overall, I would say we have probably about 5 years to address this issue. Because after about 5 or 6 years, you start to see the deficit gets so much bigger and the debt gets so much bigger that paying the interest cost means you'll never balance the budget again. In fact, Paul Ryan's budget, which has been savaged as being so tough and so draconian, doesn't even balance the budget for 25 years. Because the longer you wait, the more debt you build up, the more interest you have to pay, and the more long-term spending rises. So we really just have a couple years. And if we don't do anything about it, what happens is an economic crisis. Basically, at some point, the bond market says, Washington's about $20 trillion in the hole. Maybe they may not be able to come up with that. And because in Washington, in their infinite wisdom, is relying completely on short-term debt that we have to consistently roll over, once they get nervous, they may not want to buy the renewal of our debt. Interest rates go up. People leave the dollar, and then the cost of government really goes up. The stock market starts to fall apart. That's what we're facing in the next couple of years.
Just to put a finer point on the easy search for alternative solutions. You know, I talk to a lot of people and they say, well, if we just repeal the tax cuts for the rich, problem solved. Ending the tax cuts for the rich comes to 1/30 of the cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid over the next decade. I hear other people say, well, if we just eliminate foreign aid, 1/33 of the cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Well, what if we immediately pull out of Afghanistan and Iraq? Again, 1/33 of the cost. Now, that's not to say we can't do those. That's not to say don't do any of them. Every dollar helps. And some of these policies, I mean, cutting waste, corporate welfare, you bet.
Every dollar helps. But we can't kid ourselves that that's the solution that gets us off the hook. It still isn't enough. Really, these are the costs that are driving the problem.
So what do? If we don't want to tax away on it, we can't eliminate other programs, let's modernize and fix Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Reform is the only way to avoid an economic crisis. We talk a lot about holding harmless everyone over the age of 55, and I think that's very fair. You've paid in your whole life, you're close to retirement, that's very fair. But if we're going to do that, we better hurry up. Every year, 4 million baby boomers turn 55. By 2019, they'll all be 55. At that point, you've grandfathered out the entire baby boom generation,
which means you've grandfathered in all the scary numbers I showed you earlier. The way that I would reform these programs is, I think first off, you begin by having to create spending caps on Social Security and Medicare. You have to have some target that says we want these programs to grow at this rate and not much more. Especially in Medicare and Medicaid. We are the only government in the world that writes a blank check for health care. We're the only government in the world that says whatever it spends, it spends. We don't set a budget for it. We just write checks. Can't do it. You need to have some sort of budget and cap for these programs. Just like families set budgets, it's time for Washington to take these programs off autopilot and set a budget. After that, adjusting Social Security or fixing Social Security is easy. It's really easy for me because I'm not running for office. If I was running for office, I'd be hiding in the podium right now. Social Security can be fixed by adjusting the eligibility age. You know, right now it's 66, on its way to 67. If you slowly move it up towards 68, 69, 70 over the next couple decades, because let's face it, we cannot afford to have people spending 1/3 of their adult lives in taxpayer-funded retirement. We simply can't afford it. And we start to adjust benefits at the upper incomes. Why start at the upper incomes? Because it's better than starting with the poor. You start to tell people at the top, you're still going to get a benefit, but you may not get as much of a benefit. If you're making $200,000 a year, you may not get as much of a benefit as you thought you were going to get. Social Security is easy. Medicare is the difficult one because, again, you have to fix health inflation. There's really two different approaches to fixing Medicare. Government rationing and the choice and competition model. I personally think the best approach is what's called premium support, where you actually allow seniors to pick their own Medicare plan that they pick, that they want, and have the government then subsidize a large portion of that plan. That's what members of Congress have. That's what federal employees have. That's how the Medicare drug entitlement works. And it's been shown to reduce costs. Either you can have rationing by unelected bureaucrat in Washington, or you can do it this way, where you have actually the market reduce costs by choice and competition. Basically, you can have Medicare reduce its spending by restricting choices or by expanding choices. This is the option of expanding choices. You can also, I think, reform Medicaid by encouraging the purchase of long-term care insurance. Very few people buy long-term care insurance. We need to encourage savings, and we need to encourage people to buy long-term care insurance because we can't have Medicaid paying $40,000, $50,000 a year for nursing homes. Overall, I've thrown a lot of numbers at you because, again, I'm a geek and I'm a budget person, and this is what we do. But this isn't about economics. This is about America's future. This is about whether or not we want to guarantee the prosperity, the economic growth, the jobs that we've benefited from, at least until about 2 or 3 years ago, for future generations. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid have been very successful programs. We want to keep them. Keeping them then means modernizing them. Leaving them the way they are is not an option. Hate to break it to you, they cannot stay the way they are, or the country goes bankrupt. In the absence of reform, we are going to face real economic difficulties. But it doesn't have to be this way.
We have overcome depressions. We have overcome world wars. We can overcome this. But it's not going to happen automatically. The reason we're going to overcome this is because I believe that this nation is going to get together and roll up our sleeves, old and young, Republican and Democrat, and actually address this. But you have to take the lead. Because let me tell you, the reason I titled my presentation What Washington Won't Tell You, politicians don't want to tell you this. They know about it, but they don't want to tell you how bad things are going to get because they're afraid that if you know how bad things are going to be, you'll vote them out of office. They basically don't trust you with this information. They're in the business of handing out goodies. They're not in the business of telling you, look, the system is unsustainable. So it's important to realize you are the ones who have to take the lead and convince lawmakers that you're ready for an adult conversation. Even if you don't even like the reforms, even if you don't like my solutions, fine. But we need to have a conversation as a nation on this. And I want you to take the lead on that. With that, happy to open it up to questions, comments, insults, dirty looks.
Why don't people buy long-term health care insurance, and how would you get them to do it?
The question is, why don't people buy long-term care insurance, and how can we fix that? The first answer, according to surveys, is because people think Medicare covers it. They don't find out until they retire that Medicare doesn't cover long-term care insurance. And so then you get in a tough position where you have to go on Medicaid, but before you go on Medicaid, you have to liquidate your assets. It's a very tough thing. The other reason is long-term care insurance right now is expensive. What I would support is basically a sort of government encouraging people to buy it, whether through health savings accounts, tax credits, you name it. We have to get people to buy the insurance. I think government, the same way we encourage savings elsewhere, which is, don't tax it, let people buy it tax-free, let people use an HSA. I would even be willing to have the government provide a slight match for some of it, just to get people to buy the insurance. That's a lot cheaper than not buying it and relying on the government, because ultimately it's too expensive. Yes, sir.
As a follow-up to that, though, I understood that with regards to long-term care insurance, that it's so expensive. I understand that once you check into a nursing home, the average stay is 18 to 24 months.
18 to 24 months, you're right. And at a cost, nursing homes can cost about $40,000 a year. So that's about $80,000 over a 2-year period. There are people who are in there a lot longer than that, and it costs more. It adds up for Medicaid. I think it's important to get insurance for something that expensive, because ultimately there's been some talk. Actually, the new health care law signed by President Obama added a long-term care plan, but the way they did it is that created a system where you can buy into a government long-term care plan. But the way they actually did it was you buy into the system, you can't receive benefits for 5 years, and in those 5 years, all the money that you paid in gets taken out to pay for the new health care law. Just kind of people are upset that Social Security gets raided. Well, the reason they put this into the new health care law was that it provided a piggy bank that from money that's actually going to go into the new health care law. So I'm not sure that's the best way to take a look at it. I think that we need to encourage private purchase of long-term care insurance. Right there, sir.
Your presentation focused on 3 institutions, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that you contend need to be changed to solve this problem. I would like you to tell us whether you've thought about more fundamental institutional change, that is, the basic budgetary process and what's permissible under the budgetary process. That's number one. And number two, the current ability of the Federal Reserve Bank to monetize the debt, which fundamentally means that the federal government doesn't feel that debt can strengthen the law.
Yeah, to answer the first question, constitutionally, Congress can pretty much can spend on whatever they want. I mean, the original constitutional law, that people would say, limits what Congress can spend money on. The Supreme Court has obliterated that. So what we're left with, the only real way I think the Supreme Court will allow us to restrain government and spending is to have spending caps. Some sort of cap. There's right now in Congress bills that would limit the growth of government to say inflation plus population, or limit federal spending to 20% of the economy, which is the historical average. Of course, short of a constitutional amendment, any law can be repealed by the next law. So that's the challenge. In regards to the Federal Reserve, there is certainly a chance they can try to monetize this. I would hope they do not, because that's just going to raise interest rates. And then you're in the same boat as you were before, where the costs are growing out of control. I don't think Ben Bernanke would monetize it, but when you hit a crisis, you never know what's going to happen. And we've seen, the Federal Reserve is willing to at least take a little bit into the economy when they think they need it, as we've seen with QE1 and QE2. But an overall monetization, I think, is unlikely at this point, and I hope I'm right. Yes, sir.
You mentioned healthcare inflation a few times. Do you know the statistics behind that, as far as what annual percentage inflation is in healthcare?
Sure. The way economists measure it is the growth is that whether or not healthcare costs are growing as fast as the economy on a per capita basis. Now, the economy nominally usually grows about 5 to 5.5% per year, unadjusted for inflation. Historically, healthcare has grown at per capita GDP plus 3%. So if the economy if the GDP per person has grown 5.5%, it means that healthcare costs grew 8.5%. And what that means is overall, if healthcare is growing faster than the economy, it ends up consuming more and more of the economy. And right now, healthcare is consuming about almost 20% of the economy. Now, these tables take into account the federal government's assumption that healthcare costs in the future will only grow at GDP plus 1%. The government has no plan to actually accomplish that, but they just said, we're just going to assume that instead of growing 3 points faster than the economy, it's only going to grow 1 point faster than the economy. If that turns out to be wrong, then the things that go like this will go like this. That's another reason this was the rosy scenario. Any questions in the back? Yes, sir. Again, the data that I gave, this is pretty much from the Congressional Budget Office. So
Well, that's why I'm going to ask you a geek question to a geek.
Yeah.
I just have felt in the past that the deficit projection is hidden by the Altman tax that continues to get fixed every year, every 2 years. And your projections, are you showing it with or without the fix?
I am doing the current policy projection, which means I take out the gimmicks. I assume that the AMT is going to be patched every year. I assume that the Medicare doc fix is going to occur every year. I take out the gimmicks that Congress requires CBO uses to make the deficit look smaller. And I say if we really keep today's policies in place, today's tax cuts, today's AMT patch, today's Medicare doc fix, that's what the numbers look like. Yes, back corner.
One of the points that I thought was kind of interesting, I've never seen anybody bring up, is that the largest job growth lately has been of government employees. Most of those people, government employees, a lot of teachers in Missouri pay a different retirement system. If all of those people were forced to join the Social Security system, are there any numbers on that you may know about how would that slow the problem, give us a little more breathing room or something like that?
Yeah, the question is whether or not adding a lot of people who aren't currently in the Social Security system would fix the problem. In the short term, I believe it would close a small fraction of the gap, like I think maybe about a fifth or a tenth. Long term, they're going to want their benefits too. And so long term, you actually make the problem probably worse. In the short term, you get a little bit of breathing room, but it's not a solution. Yes, sir?
I'm looking at your chart here, and I see Medicaid is defense, I get in ways, but I don't see anywhere where it talks about reforming the criminal justice system so we're not arresting, incarcerating, and spending on unnecessary raids on this chart. And I want to mention that some people have to put criminal record on job applications so they can't get a job to pay taxes.
Right. The question is, why aren't we reflecting the cost of more law enforcement, over-incarceration, those sorts of issues? Basically, that doesn't have much of an effect on federal finances. That's mostly, prisons are mostly, and incarceration and law enforcement is mostly financed by state and local governments. The federal cost, the FBI is about $2 to $3 billion a year. Federal prisons are about $3 billion a year. DEA is about $2 or $3 billion. So you're looking at only about $10 billion a year being the federal cost. So over 10 years, you're only saving about $100 billion, which is tiny. But at the state and local level, that's a huge part of the budget. Yes, sir.
Well, I guess I'm part of the problem. I'm one of those older fellows.
It's not your fault, sir.
As I say that, I am part of the problem because I have been here, watched this problem develop over all these years, and have voted those people back into office. And I therefore feel that we older people need to suffer also in this affair. Now, skew it any way you want to skew it, but I think consider making me pay more Medicare, whether it be catastrophic care or some other facet. I think I'm responsible too. Back to Social Security now, I disagree with you wholeheartedly with limiting the upper level of Social Security. Social Security today is skewed where the lower paid people get a much greater percentage return than the old people. Just go ahead and reduce it for everybody, but just reverse skew it. Make the rich people take a bigger cut than the other folks.
Okay, that's a good question. I think it's important. On Medicare, something has to be done. Right now, the average couple that's 55 right now and earns an average income will pay $140,000 into the Medicare system over their lifetime and receive $430,000 in benefits. It's a pretty good deal they make. But I also think that some people who are currently a little older, if we're going to say shared sacrifice, I think there's a case to be made for all ages having some, at the caveat that we don't want to just put people into poverty where you're just reducing their Social Security benefits and then putting them on welfare. But I think ultimately, if we're going to do shared sacrifice, I think that there's a case to be made for allowing at least some degree of everyone to have some sacrifice. The reason that's not happening is because you are a minority on that. I mean, the polls, politicians are scared to death.
Do we have one more question?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can.
Thank you, Mr. Riedl. I certainly appreciate the presentation, and there are points there that I do agree with. Purposely, as a banker, watched the markets yesterday, and for a moment, the market was up and reacting to Bin Laden's death. But as soon as Secretary Geithner started talking about the debt ceiling, the markets reacted because they recognize that we have to do some housekeeping and get our spending in control as well as deal with the debt ceiling. So I do agree with you on those points. To the gentleman's comments over here, with me being Generation X, I don't think we need to have our seniors shoulder this burden. These people have worked hard to put us in a position where we are as the #1 country in the world. So I think that respect, it's up to Generation X and millennials to do what we can, and I think you cannot solve this problem without the business community. You have to include the business community because there are things that they can do. I follow the news every day. You've got $1 trillion plus surplus sitting out there idly because corporate America is not investing in terms of innovation and job creation and so forth. We have to engage them, and that's something that we have to hold Washington accountable for on both parts. So you have to include the private sector, but having said that, you have to go a step further. There's incentives that we can do. If it's long-term care that's needed, then you have to look at ways that we can offer tax incentives or tax breaks to start moving our people in that direction. But I think what really has to happen is for us to have a conversation. We've had child play in Washington the past 2 years, and the problem is getting bigger. But I think what we need to do is engage the private community more. We need to get out and start talking to the people that this is going to impact, like people like myself, and we got to start doing it now.
I mean, on the debt limit, that's going to be the big debate. I think anything big that's going to happen is going to be attached to the debt limit vote. Ultimately, Congress is going to raise the debt limit. The question is, are they going to attach reforms to make sure that we're not back here in a year in the same vote? And while the market's nervous about raising the debt limit, they should also be nervous about raising the debt limit without any reforms, because then we're right back where we are. In regards to your second point, I do think we have to do a lot more to encourage investment. I think we have to do a lot more to get the economy going and creating jobs. And right now, I think that 15 million unemployed people, you're not gonna solve any economic or budget problem with 15 people not employed, not earning incomes, and not paying taxes. Although ultimately, economic growth ain't going to solve this. I mean, economic growth can close a small portion of the gap, but not much. And so then you're left with the choice between 63 and 88% tax rates or fixing the spending.
Thank you.